O death, where is thy victory? O death, where is thy sting? Hello, and welcome once again to the Lepanto Institute podcast, Bold and Stupid Men. I'm your host, Michael Hitchborn. The saints have spoken often and with great clarity about death. The reason is simple. Our entire faith is built around the fact that death has been conquered, and the good news that we are called to preach to the whole world is that death is not forever, and that the souls of the just will be reunited for all eternity with their loved ones in heaven. St. Cyprian of Carthage tells us that death is not an ending, but a transition, and, this journey through time having been completed, a passage into eternity. Who would not hasten to better things? He went on to say, "Our brethren who are freed from this world by our Lord's summons are not to be mourned, since we know that they are not lost to us, but only sent ahead of us. Departing from us, they precede us as travelers, just as navigators are accustomed to do." St. John Chrysostom said, "What is death at most? It is a journey for a season, a sleep longer than usual. If you fear death, you should also fear sleep." St. Bernard of Clairvaux called death the gate of life. The good news is that our greatest hope is in a good death. Yesterday, I buried my grandfather, but I've spent the last couple of years saying goodbye. It's impossible to explain what my grandfather meant to me, but there are a few things I should like to say about him so that you'll understand just what a beautiful death he had. I was blessed to have grandparents that lived right next door as I was growing up. Coming home from school, I would head over to their house to do homework. My grandmother helped me with grammar and history, and my grandfather helped me with math and science. After I finished my homework, I would spend hours and hours talking to them about everything, from politics to religion to recent events, and ultimately, to story after story about their lives together. Most nights, my mother would call to ask if I was coming home for dinner, and sometimes at around midnight, she would call again to make sure that I locked the door when I came in. My visits became less frequent after I left for college, and by the time I got married, my grandmother had developed Alzheimer's. My grandfather did everything to care for her and spent as much time with her as he could. In fact, he was feeding her when she died, just 8 days after my first child was born. In the years that followed, my grandfather and I remained close. We met for lunches, and every time we visited my parents, I always made sure to head next door to spend a couple of hours with him. About 4 years ago, the reality that the time that I had with him was coming to a close became startlingly evident. He was suffering congestive heart failure. From that point on, every visit that I had with him came with some acknowledgement that his earthly journey was ending. I didn't realize he hadn't worn a brown scapular for a long time, so I gave him mine. When we talked about how he was feeling on any given day, he eventually wound up talking about the 4 last things. He frequently asked me for prayers, which I promised, and he always mentioned how he remembered each of us in his rosaries, chaplets, and other prayers. He told me how he offered his suffering up for us, and I promised that as soon as he died, I would have the 30 Gregorian Masses said for him. We had our most frank conversation about death last fall. He told me that he knew that his time was drawing near, and I told him that my wife and I were praying a 9-month novena from the Annunciation to Christmas, asking Our Lady to grant him a happy death. I also told him that my children never forgot to include him in our daily rosary intentions. He was not only grateful but joyful about the prayers being said for him and asked us to keep them coming, which we did. During this conversation, as we were talking about the life to come, I made him promise me something, which he did. He promised me that when he met our Lord upon the cross, that he would ask to be the patron for my family. He renewed that promise several times over the succeeding months, and in return, I increased my prayers on his behalf. One thing I told him was that when he received the last rites, I wanted him to request the apostolic pardon from the priest because it was a plenary indulgence that would clear the way for his entrance into heaven. I know that my grandfather suffered quite a bit in his last months. He was bedridden, he was struggling to breathe, his personal dignity was stripped from him as he relied entirely on the help of others in physical necessities. And through it all, I never heard him utter a single complaint, but he offered his suffering for the sake of others. The week before he died, I stayed overnight at my parents' house to care for him. I did most of the talking, as it was a struggle for him to speak. He mentioned to me that he had gone to confession recently and spoke with the priest about the apostolic pardon. He said, "I'm thinking about not asking for the pardon because I deserve whatever punishment is coming to me." He then told me that the priest said, "You need to let God do what he wants." It wasn't a response that he expected, and in his humility was one that he fully embraced. The following week, his condition rapidly deteriorated. My sister and her children came to see him one last time, and that evening he received last rites and the apostolic pardon. The next day, my family and I all came to say our final goodbyes to him as well. Several months ago, I prayed and asked two things of Our Lady. I asked to be present when he died, and I asked that she personally escort him to her Son, our Lord, when he would take his first steps into eternity. I take a great deal of consolation in the fact that I was able to be present for his death as an external sign of the more hidden second request. But even there, that second request wasn't so hidden from what we observed. I sat and prayed for my grandfather for several hours as he was dying. On Facebook and through the Lepanto Institute email list, I asked people to pray the rosary for the specific intention of Our Lady welcoming him into paradise. As I sat with him, I saw just how thin and frail my grandfather had become. He could barely speak more than a whisper, and his frame was little more than a skeleton. He was constantly shifting himself in bed, trying to find a more comfortable position, but in these hours there was none to be found. Occasionally he muttered something like, "Yes, sure." I asked him if there was something I could get him, and he would shake his head no. He never lost his mental acuity and could answer all my questions with certainty. My wife and mother told me that at one point, before I got there, he kept gesturing toward the ceiling fan. He motioned that he wanted them to take a picture of something around the ceiling fan, saying, "Can't you see it?" As I watched him, I saw on a couple of occasions that he was moving his hands in front of him as if he was grabbing something. And at one point, I distinctly saw him form a circle with his arms as if he was embracing something or someone. I asked him if I could get him something, and he said no. I saw that his mouth was dry and asked if he was thirsty. He waved his hand as if to indicate somewhat, so I brought a cup with a straw in it to his lips to give him a drink. He couldn't even form his lips over the straw. I wound up dipping a small sponge in the water and bringing it to his lips so that he could parch his thirst, and that's when it hit me. We are all called to be a reflection of our Lord. St. Paul exhorts us to strip ourselves of the old man with his deeds, and putting on the new, him who is renewed unto knowledge, according to the image of him that created him. As I applied the sponge to my grandfather's lips, I recalled Psalm 21, which said, "My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue hath cleaved to my jaws, and thou hast brought me down unto the dust of death." I saw again his skeletal figure, and the psalm again came to mind, "They have numbered all my bones, and they have looked and stared upon me." I sat and prayed some more for him, this time praying a prayer to be said when death is imminent. By this time, thousands of people all over the world were praying for him. At around 10 o'clock that evening, my mother came in to sit with him, so I went over to him one last time. I gently touched his arm and leaned in close so he could hear me, and I said, "I'm going to bed now, Papa. I love you, and I'll see you in the morning." No sooner had the words escaped my lips that I knew that I wouldn't see him in the morning. With labored breath at barely a whisper, he said, "I love you too." I kissed his forehead and left the room. Just a little over an hour later, my mother called for me. He died peacefully in his sleep as she prayed the sorrowful mysteries of the rosary at his bedside. In life, my grandfather gave me many lessons about my faith, my character, about true charity, and many other things. And even as he was dying, he was still teaching me. This time, he was teaching me what it meant to die well. So in the end, I can only repeat to my grandfather what St. Bernard of Clairvaux said of the death of a loved one. I can never lose one whom I love to the end. One whom my soul cleaves so firmly that it can never be separated does not go away, but only goes before. Be mindful of me when you come to where I shall follow you. Eternal rest grant unto him, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon him. May his soul and all the souls of the faithful departed, through the mercy of God, rest in peace. God love you.